thank you so much. It's wonderful that you could come and be with us, Professor Campbell.
Thank you.
Everybody here is very happy, and they were very excited when they saw that we could have you on Skype, so this is really great. I know, just to ask you, you came from Italy. You were in Italy last month or this month? Last month?
That's correct. Yes, last month.
And you had a presentation, and you also went to a food and agricultural organization, to FAO.
Yes, I spoke at the FAO at the United Nations in Rome.
Yeah, I saw the lecture online. It was really interesting. Did you also go to, was it Lithuania this fall?
On a different trip, about in September, I went to Lithuania, Vilnius.
Okay.
And spoke to a group of medical doctors.
So next time it might be Norway?
Maybe, could be.
If we're lucky and we're able to do it, we would really like to do that. Thank you. We don't have much time, so we're going to just ease into the next Q&A session. But like I said, I think it would be good if you could talk a little bit based on the discussion that we had in the panel, and I will just sum up a little bit what was said, and then you can talk from there. Is that okay? Okay. So one issue that came up was, well, everybody thinks highly of the China study, and thank you very much for that. But some issues that we were discussing were, for instance, children. That was one issue that came up. What about children and this type of nutrition? Because one of the panelists had worked in developing countries where she thought perhaps there might be a problem with undernutrition based on what she saw. That's number one. The second question that came up was, what about the Mediterranean diet? Because as a person, the other panelist needs concrete evidence when she works at the hospital, and Mediterranean diet has come up with some concrete evidence, just like the New England Journal of Medicine, this study that came up last year that everybody's talking about. So that's question number two. And then the third issue, there are a lot of issues, but I think because that came up and that often comes up, is about fish. So I think maybe you can start from there. Is that okay?
Yes. Okay. You want me first to speak about the relationship of this diet with childhood nutrition or children?
Yes.
I can speak to this to some extent professionally as well as personally. Professionally, according to the scientific evidence that I am familiar with, the sooner that children get onto this kind of diet, the better their long-term health is going to be. And I see no evidence that nutritional deficiencies occur in children at a young age, as soon as their breastfeeding is over. As a matter of fact, on a more personal side, I know it's limited, but we have grandchildren who started out totally 100% on a whole food plant-based diet. They're now in their late teens, 20, 21 years of age. They had outstanding health during their entire years. They were excellent athletes, especially, and very good at school. There's no problem. So I don't see the need to be concerned about children. In fact, I think it's a good idea to start children early because it allows them to accommodate to the diet early on. Their bodies become accommodated to it. They then establish preferences for taste that last them for a lifetime. So that's all I can really say. I mean, we haven't had longitudinal studies on children doing exactly this kind of diet. But in any case, I see no evidence against doing this kind of diet. In fact, all the evidence I see is in favor of doing this kind of diet. On the Mediterranean diet, I know there's a paper recently published this year, in the early part of the year, in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think the audience is probably familiar with that study. It was a study done in Spain. And they were comparing the effect of Mediterranean diet on cardiovascular events, as everyone knows, heart disease and stroke. And so they had three groups. One group was the so-called low-fat diet, more or less the standard diet. The second group had the Mediterranean diet, but supplemented with oil. And the third group had the Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts. Now, the number of cardiovascular events that occurred during this observation period for the standard control diet, the number of events was 109. The number of events occurring for the Mediterranean diet with oil was 96. And the number of events occurring with the Mediterranean diet with the nuts was 83. So we had the control group 109, Mediterranean diet 96, and then 83. There was not totally significant, but it was bordering on statistical significance. And so it was certainly interesting. Here's the problem I have with that study. It may be true that the Mediterranean diet is better. I think it is. I think we generally agree that cardiovascular events and other diseases goes down with the Mediterranean diet. However, it only goes down a small amount because in reality, in rural China, for example, when people are much closer to a whole food plant-based diet, they don't have 83 events or 96 events, as was the case with the nuts and the oil. They have close to zero. And in this country, we have now done some studies here. When people are on 100% whole food plant-based, not Mediterranean, the results we get are far better than Mediterranean. So my question is, why is the Mediterranean diet promoting so much heart disease? This is something I think that probably many might disagree with, but I would suggest that this is really what's been involved. The Mediterranean diet is somewhat better than the typical Western diet, but it could be much better. The difference between oil and nuts, maybe also, that might help to some extent too. We don't know for sure, but I think the two Mediterranean diet results are rather similar, indicating some benefit, about a 25-30% reduction in risk. I don't understand it can be 100% reduction in risk for heart disease or very close to it. On fish, on the fish question, I know in Norway this is an important question. And from my understanding of the fish is kind of complex to some extent. The fish protein has been shown many years ago to be very similar to mammalian or land animal protein in its ability to be able to raise cholesterol levels and maybe to promote heart disease. But there is, of course, evidence that I'm sure everyone agrees with, that with fish, the argument is similar to the Mediterranean diet. Maybe some benefits, especially with the right kind of fish, especially the fish, obviously, that have a lot of omega-3 fat, there's some benefit. I mean, I understand there's some differences between where the fish are coming from, but the fish don't have really any significant amount of antioxidants. They don't have really any significant amount of complex carbohydrates. And those are two very important nutrient groups present in plants, not generally present in fish, unless the fish is consuming that kind of the antioxidants. So my understanding of fish is that yes, some benefit, but not the full benefit. So I'm strictly speaking on the basis of the evidence I have, and I know that many people can subsist on fish all their lives. As long as they have a good whole food plant-based diet, they probably really do quite well. So I'm talking about whatever problems may occur with fish is kind of small.
Great. You still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. The question that I forgot actually was also related to the EPIC study. Do you know the EPIC study?
Yes, I do. By Tim Key. Or it's actually, yeah, I know that study because I know the individuals who were involved in that, I know the director personally. I know him from some years ago. I knew some of the other investigators. It's a very ambitious study. It's a well-done study, excellent researchers, and they have produced a lot of very important and useful and good information. No question about that. So I greatly admire their effort, what they did. However, the EPIC study suffers from the same limitation as does the studies on the Mediterranean diet, as do the studies, for example, in this country, on the typical Atkins-type diets. Most of the people, in fact, virtually all of the people in that study, there was almost no one consuming the whole food plant-based diet. Almost no one. They have varying degrees of, let's say, animal food content or varying degrees of processed foods. That's true. And so we can see some results that suggest benefits from eating plants for sure. But their fat intake is still, even at the lowest levels, their fat intake is still pretty high. The percentage of animal food in their diets, even for those who have the least, is still significant. So the EPIC study is based on examining a Western population in Europe, obviously, based on examining Western population, most of whom are consuming still fairly high fat diets, high animal food diets, and also an unfortunate amount of processed foods. Maybe not as much in Europe as in the United States, but nonetheless, the EPIC study is limited. Through no fault of the researchers. Researchers are excellent. The people who organized this, and they analyzed the data very well, and they got some good information. But I'm just saying, from that perspective, we don't have the whole food plant-based diet in that study. That's the diet, in my view, that I am now finding, is it has an extraordinary property. And that diet is not included in almost in any of the studies that's published in the literature, whether it's in Europe, this country, elsewhere in the world. We just don't include those kind of people. So therefore, I don't see why some people might want to criticize the whole food plant-based diet when, in fact, A, they haven't tried it, and B, it's not been in the literature. They haven't tried it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it relates to the same, you and I talked about this one yesterday. There was this article in 2011 about fruit and vegetables and cancer risk by Professor T.J. Kay at the Oxford University. It was a study where he basically sums up all the literature and says fruit and vegetables don't have any effect on cancer risk. Is that the same issue working?
Yes, it's the same issue, and I can say the same thing too. I know Dr. Tim Key very well. In fact, he and I co-authored papers together, actually using the China study when I was at Oxford for a year. So Tim Key and his colleagues, again, they're excellent researchers. And I should point out that Tim Key himself is a vegan. So if there's any personal bias there, he would tend to want to find that kind of result. But Dr. Key he's a good researcher, and he looked at the data the way they were. He summarizes in the article, I think, to which you're referring, he summarizes the many studies that have been done on fruits and vegetables, especially relates to cancer and other diseases. And he concludes that much of the scientific information that's been collected in the recent years is not very impressive. He also points out, and I would agree, he also points out that maybe the problem is we see some results from prospective or cross-sectional studies, a certain kind of experimental study design, and we don't see it in case control, for example. So he thinks that it's an issue of experimental study design. I say it is not. That is not the point. The problem with again, those studies to which he refers, almost across the board, we're studying people, almost none of whom are consuming a whole food plant-based diet. And the reason I keep pointing this out, the emphasis on the whole food plant-based diet, it's not part of the scientific investigation world. Yet, on the other hand, and this is what many people don't know, maybe some people in your audience know this, but when we take people with heart disease or other kinds of ailments, and we put them on a diet, we see dramatic results quite quickly across the board for a whole variety of different ailments. And it happens very fast. That kind of result, those kind of subjects are not present in the typical studies that we've been doing for the last few decades. So as long as we don't want to study that group, therefore we cannot make inferences. We cannot make conclusions about what that diet may do, because I know what it can do. I've been involved in a number of studies in this country, not yet published, that show really, truly dramatic results. So I think science, and I've been part of science myself for many years, I think science has basically been shortchanging these kind of investigations and are not getting the kind of results that are very relevant to what we're now talking about.
Exactly. So how do you get these kind of studies when there are so few people living according to this lifestyle and diet?
Well, at the present time, that's a good question. At the present time, as I say, I have wanted to do a big longitudinal study. You know, a lot of people brought into the study. We follow them for certain lengths of time and see how they do. I've been wanting to do that. So far, that kind of study has only been done a little bit with heart disease. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn in the Cleveland Clinic has done that. Dr. Neil Bernard in Washington has done that with diabetes to some extent. And also with multiple sclerosis. There's some evidence of that kind of study, but not completely. You can see the differences. And also with some cancers like melanoma and prostate cancer. Some of those kind of studies have been done, but they have mostly been done on people who are vegan. And I don't support the word vegan. The vegan word is not the whole food plant-based diet idea. People who choose to be vegan, as we all know, primarily choose to be vegan, at least in the years past. They primarily choose to be vegan because of ethical reasons, ideological reasons. And so as a result, what happens is they tend to consume diets that just as long as they no animal foods, but they consume diets that have too much processed foods and still too much fat and salt. So we see some advantages in vegans, but if we study them as part of a population, that we don't see the big advantage that we otherwise thought we would see. So I don't use the vegan group as a comparison group. I don't use the vegetarian group either, because most vegetarians are still using dairy and many of them eggs. And they have a nutrient composition kind of similar to the non-vegetarians. So just on the basis of the science, just on the basis of the physiology, I would predict they should not have that much gain. And we don't see much gain, because the nutrient composition of those diets is really what matters. So I talk about a whole food plant-based diet, not as a vegan or vegetarian diet. But people keep calling my idea a vegan diet, and it's not a vegan diet. They're misrepresenting what I'm talking about.
Yes, thank you very much. So basically, people should try it for themselves.
Yes.
We have to open up to a Q&A session now. Is that okay?
Yes, good.
Good. So we'll do that for 15 minutes again, and then you can have some, maybe you can summarize some more thinking of your thinking towards the end. So
okay.
Let's see who has a question. Somebody up there. Well. So we'll come first in Norwegian, then I'll translate it to you. Or maybe it will come in English, I'm not sure.
I can speak English. I'm a master's student in clinical nutrition here in the University of Oslo. And I'm just wondering, here in the wintertime we don't have that much sun. And as you surely know, there's not that many good sources of vitamin D in plant food. Or do you have any suggestions for what you can do to cover the vitamin D in wintertime if you want to follow this diet?
Did you hear that, Professor Campbell?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Should I answer that question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so on the vitamin D scientific studies, I think we're missing something there also. I understand that in places like Norway and other Scandinavian countries and so forth, I understand that obviously in wintertime, you don't get very much sun. And so vitamin D could become an issue. However, if we look at the vitamin D story from a physiological point of view, most of the vitamin D that is being measured, in almost all of these studies, they measure vitamin D as the storage form of vitamin D, the amount that's present in liver. That's the 25 hydroxy vitamin D. And so you see the storage come down during the winter hours. People are concerned about the storage form coming down, therefore we should take supplements. But we also know it's not the storage form that creates the primary response. It's the conversion of the storage form to a much more active form. That's a 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, often in the kidney and other tissues. That's what's important. That's what's important. So people can have low stores and not have a problem if they're able to still convert from the storage form to the active form. So that's one issue in my mind. If people look at the scientific evidence, as I say, everybody's measuring storage form. That doesn't very much. I don't know how much is in the active form. Now, it also turns out that the conversion of the storage form to the active form can be actually inhibited to some extent by an acid-like environment in the body, which can in turn be created by animal protein diets, as well as perhaps other kinds of diets. And so on the vitamin D deficiency question, I would want to see first, I want to see measurements of the 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. And I'd also like to see physiological pH and sort of factor that into the question. Now, I know that that's not really possible in the clinic, that much. And so therefore, vitamin D supplementation is called for as the storage goes down. I can accept that. I can understand that just to be safe. But actually, quite frankly, my vitamin Ds are low, quite low by standards. So is my wife. We're outside a lot. And so the question, that's the storage form, And I support the idea, if there's evidence, of using vitamin D supplements during those winter months. But I'm not convinced that there really is very much evidence to indicate that's a real problem. Just because the levels are not down doesn't mean necessarily a problem.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Hi, my name is Jorn. I'm a reductionist, a chemist, and a toxicologist. I have two questions. One is relating to Dr. Campbell's studies regarding the 80-10-10 diet. I wonder if I can get some remarks from you on that. The other thing was an issue that was brought up in the panel here regarding the toxicity or possible toxicity on overdoses of protein. And I guess the question then is what's kind of the optimal ratios of protein? Thanks.
Did you hear that?
Not totally, not
Okay.
the whole study.
So you would like him to comment on the 80-10-10
Yes.
whole foods, plant-based diet, basically,
Yes.
right? And that's, I'm not sure what kind of comments you want, but you want to
some reflections.
Yeah, some reflections around the 80-10-10, because some people also in the panel said that having too many carbohydrates is a problem, that it affects the triglycerides levels in the blood and so on. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is about toxicity. We have some fitness people here who take a lot of, I guess, supplements from animal-based sources, and they're now afraid that they're walking towards death. So do you have any questions about the toxicity of these protein supplements that these bodybuilders take?
Yes, I'll take that question first. Of course, especially athletes. Athletes like to use protein supplements. We know that. It turns out that from my analysis of the literature, that a whole food plant-based diet not only has enough protein, it has the ideal level of protein, which is about 10%. And this is a discussion I can't make here because it will take a little longer to do that. So I regard the ideal diet having 10% protein, 10% plus or minus 2%, something like that. The fat, I also think it should be around 10% plus or minus maybe 2%. That's the kind of levels that's present in the whole food plant-based diet, the whole vegetables, the whole greens, and so forth and so on. That's what we need. And it's enough. It's not only enough, it's ideal. It's really ideal. And so I support the idea of 80-10-10. Now, the question concerning the carbohydrate. Obviously, in a whole food plant-based diet, we're talking about 70 to 80% or more total carbohydrate. High carb diet. Exactly the opposite of the so-called Atkins diet or the low carb diet. So we're talking about an 80% carbohydrate diet. However, I'm talking about 100% natural carbohydrates, very complex in many cases. Some of them are classified as fibrous components. That kind of carbohydrate is A, very important for energy, and B, it's also very important for gastrointestinal health. That's where we, I think, have the most evidence. And so I think the opposite of that is the high protein diet. That is the diet that has especially more than 15% or something, because for the low carb diet, the way Atkins defined it, and other people now are defining it, they're talking about levels of carbohydrate in a diet between maybe 15 to 30% carbohydrate, which is pretty low. And so they talk about the low carb diet. In turn, if it's going to be 25% or 30%, this means the other 70 to 75% of the energy has to come from fat and protein. So the low carb diet is really a very high protein, very high fat diet. Now, I would suggest to anyone who's talking about the low carb diet to show me studies that a very high protein, very high fat diet they're really talking about. I want them to show me studies where that kind of diet can actually reverse heart disease or reverse diabetes and will be sustained over a long period of time. It's not there. And that's why those people keep talking about the low carb diet, because it sounds rather decent, a rather respectable idea. What they're relying on is that some of the carbohydrate a lot of us consume is the refined carbohydrate. And of course, refined carbohydrate, sugar, white flour, and so forth, that's not what I'm talking about. That's why I say whole food. The refined carbohydrate is a problem. Too many people consume too much of the refined carbohydrates. And therefore, with that truth, with a little bit of truth, quite frankly, they make a big lie out of the whole thing. They condemn the high carb diet, but primarily because the high carb diet for most people is very high sugar and starch, and that's a problem. I agree. But they should not use that low carb idea, in fact, to condemn the whole food plant-based diet, because that's a very different story. We actually, the whole food plant-based diet, 80% carbohydrate, for example, we find when we put diabetics on that diet, their diabetes goes away. So they have to explain to me, why does diabetes get cured when they go on this really high carb diet? I want to hear that, because they can't find the evidence.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Good evening. Is there any way around B12 supplements in your diet?
Yeah, I heard that. Yes, I think the B12 story, again, I can understand the need possibly to have some B12 supplements for people who are consuming this all plant-based diet, primarily because the B12 levels in the serum of people using this kind of diet, the B12 levels come down. That's pretty consistent. We see that in a lot of studies. The lower B12 levels are of concern to some clinicians because they feel, with some evidence, that it gets too low, then we can have deficiency symptoms like paresthesis, the tingling in in the fingers or maybe some anemia. But that sounds reasonable, so people take B12 supplements. But there's another part of that story never gets told, really, or very seldom gets told. That is when the B12 is being consumed, in order for it to be absorbed, it has to bind to intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is a protein in the stomach. And we have to be able to produce enough of that to get the benefit of the B12. And in some cases, it's clear that people are not producing enough intrinsic factor, and therefore, if they go on a low B12 diet, such as a whole food plant-based diet, they may see B12 deficiency. Because the intrinsic factor, not because necessarily they're not getting enough B12. So there's more to this story. I'm a little concerned by the popular notion and the way it's been interpreted. I think it's been interpreted in a very superficial way. But to be safe, B12 is fairly safe, and therefore taking some B12 is okay.
Thank you very much. Next question. Okay, it's coming in the back.
Hello. What is your perspective on ecological versus non-ecological plant-based foods?
I didn't hear that.
Okay, so what is your perspective on ecological versus organic vegetables versus non-organic vegetables?
Yeah, I personally rather like the organic, and we buy it when we can. We have our own garden. Of course, we produce our own organic food, and so I prefer that because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's better. The problem with the organic food, from the scientific studies that have been made so far, the problem with the organic food, when you compare that with people not consuming organic food, and that's a very difficult kind of study, so I'm talking about very limited evidence. The problem with that is that we don't see any big differences between organic and non-organic, but I still believe that on the basis of common sense, and also because non-organic food can have a lot of contamination maybe. For me, it doesn't make sense to consume that kind of food. So the problem in this country, at least, is that the organic food is kind of expensive. So everybody doesn't have access to it. But I think the other side of the argument is let's really try to cut down, on the use of fertilizers if we can, the chemical fertilizers. Let's cut down on the pesticides, herbicides, and stuff like that. That just makes sense to me, and kind of return back to a normal kind of natural food production system.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm wondering about, since the body stores vitamins and everything we need, how can we think I eat this for a week, and maybe I can eat this for a month, and then I can eat something different the next week. And how does the body regulate? Should we have everything in one day, like of the things we need, or can we choose to eat carrots and something else for a week and then change to something else? And also about the spleen being too wet, I've heard that has been a problem.
Okay, so she's asking a question about the nutrition composition. I mean, do we have to, as on a whole foods plant-based diet, can you just eat carrots one day, or do you have to keep on varying it? That's one question. And the next question is a wet spleen. I don't know what that means. Do you understand the question about a wet spleen, that a problem with a wet spleen? Have you heard anything about that?
No, I don't know what that means.
Okay, so let's focus on the first part of the question.
Okay, so I think the question is, do we need to have variation?
Yes.
In our food, so we make sure we're getting enough nutrients. That's a good question. It's been assumed for a long time that that's necessary. In reality, I support the idea, but I don't think we need to obsess over the idea. Because we don't know, for example, that a certain kind of green leafy vegetable, if it's a little bit higher in vitamin K or protein or something, that's necessarily better than the other. I mean, there's differences between different parts of the plant, that's true. And so we should consume some, I like to say, vegetables, well, not just vegetables, fruits and whole grains and legumes. Just let's consume leaves and stems and flowers and so forth, and the roots. Let's consume and the seeds. So we should consume a variety, but I don't. And so it's a good idea to have variety, but not to actually focus on it too much, making calculations. I should have this much of this and this much of this. I like the idea of just consuming a lot of greens, consuming a lot of colored vegetables. That's really important. And also minimize cooking, even eat them raw. I mean, I think that's what the evidence shows to me. And so if we do it that way, and making sure we also, I think, have enough legumes, because pretty good source of protein and some fiber and minerals. And so, yes, variety is important, but not sitting down and trying to calculate exactly what kind of variety you're going to have today, compared to tomorrow. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Thank you. There was a question here. I don't think I caught you. She needs a microphone.
I have a question of another type. I just want to ask you about your experiences of commercialism. Had commercial interest worked against you, and was it tougher for you in the beginning than it is today? Is it easier for you to come through with your scientific results?
Did you hear that?
Something about commercial interests, is that what it was?
Yes, she's very interested to know, because in the book I didn't get to cover that aspect, but in the book you talk a lot about how industry interferes both with science and research, design, you name it. So have you experienced a lot of that, and do you experience less of that as you go along?
Yes, I do. I understand what she's talking about. First, I should say that I had about 20 years, 20 successive years involved in policy development in the United States and elsewhere. And so I have seen essentially how scientific information is sort of summarized, for the public, and therefore making guidelines and things like that. I have to say I'm deeply, deeply disturbed about what the corporate sector is doing. They're distorting the science so that they can actually sell the foods they want to sell, or the food products that they want to sell. I'm really concerned about this. At least in the United States, and I would suggest too in other Western countries, the food and drug sectors in the United States, they essentially, I know this sounds harsh, but they essentially own the United States government. We live in a very capitalistic society in this country where money means a lot. And so the corporate sector, they're obviously wanting to make money. And so they will tend to make claims that favor their product. That's only natural. That's human nature. I understand that. But unfortunately, they're basically controlling the discussion about how much of different kinds of nutrients we should be having, for example. So they tend to control the guidelines that we set for the public. And the drug companies always want to talk about the idea that we can remain healthy as long as we have access to more drugs, which I think is a crazy idea. I mean, drugs are useful at times. We need them in the short run, but there's not the long-term solution to health. Hippocrates many years ago said, as I think many people know, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. And I'd like to suggest for the people listening to this that what we're now talking about, the whole food plant-based diet, if one goes back and looks at the ancient Greek literature, that's really what they were talking about. They were talking about the value of consuming plant-based foods in order to generate health. And it worked like medicine. It essentially worked like medicine. Diseases were less. Not only were diseases prevented, but most importantly, you can actually now, and we know this, we can actually cure existing diseases with this diet. like reversing heart disease and diabetes, and we should stop the progression of these things. So unfortunately, this story for a long time has not been told because we have been dominated by information coming from the private sector. It's a serious problem. It's a very serious problem, and I think we all need to think a little more carefully about this, because in the United States, at least, now we have really serious consequences. Our health care costs are breaking the bank. It's really causing severe problems in this country, the health care costs. And the only kind of discussion is taking place, how do we get more drugs in order to stop? Just so ridiculous. It's so out of hand. But there's one more issue, and I just was involved in a small conference this weekend on this that is really, really important. It has to do with the role of food in environmental problems. The environmental problems are serious. I think many of us will agree. Whether we're talking about global warming or whether we're talking about soil erosion, that's a serious problem, or depletion of water, those kind of things. Soil erosion is now at a point, environmental problems are now at a point where some are predicting we may be reaching the tipping point within 5 to 10 years, beyond which it might be too late. So I want to just really urge everyone, listen to what I'm saying, is that the environmental problems are enough alone for us to ask serious questions about how to bring it under control. And we now know, the evidence clearly shows, when we rely on a livestock-based agricultural system that requires maybe 7 to 10 times as much land to get the same nutritional value, when we rely on that system, that leads in turn to these environmental problems. So the linkage between food and environment is extremely important. And so I would hope that environmental scientists and other interested parties in the environment will join forces with the food sector and the nutritionists and start communicating this idea to the public. It's very serious.
Okay, 2 more questions?
Yes.
Fine, great.
Good evening, Mr. Campbell. You're a giant in your field. Thank you for taking our questions. I've been reading Whole, and I understand your frustration. And what you told us just now about being worked against, I don't know if Max Gerson is a known name for you. Max Gerson. And is it true that he cures cancer? Or second name could be John Yudkin. About sugar. Are there many, many people like you being worked against? And Max Gerson and John Yudkin would be really interesting to hear about, because you're one of the few old enough to know about that story. Thank you.
You need to repeat that. I heard some of it, but not all.
It's better that I repeat because I have a direct microphone. He's thanking you for your great work and all that, and he would like to know if you know about Max Gerson's work.
Yes, I do.
And do you have any comments about that?
Well, to my knowledge, there's only been one report in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and it's very, very interesting. It's very impressive. It was a report on melanoma, very serious skin condition or skin cancer. What they were able to show is that when people went on to this more plant-based diet, along with some other things, but what they were able to show was there was really quite a dramatic reduction in the recurrence of melanoma. Once it occurred, they were with a diet that was basically more plant-based. That's what they were able to show. That was published, and it was really quite impressive. Unfortunately, it was published in an alternative journal, so it hasn't received very much attention. So that's been done with the Gerson data. I also know Charlotte Gerson, who was the daughter of Max Gerson, Dr. Gerson. She is now in her 90s, still very healthy, very lady, and she has continued working with her group to try to get the message out there. But they're having a hard time because the Gerson idea that was brought to this country by Dr. Max Gerson many years ago in the 1940s, I think, he took a lot of criticism, so serious criticism that he had to leave the United States and go across the border to Mexico to practice. The studies that he's doing, though, I suggest are somewhat limited. Now it's being done in this country to some extent, but it's somewhat limited because oftentimes the patients he works with have already been treated, for example, with pretty harsh drugs, chemotherapy and things like that. Under those circumstances, the dietary effect, it's common sense to assume that it's not going to be as effective if you had people just immediately come into this point of view whenever they have an illness. So I think the Gerson example is a good example of, how a good idea gets lost, how it's basically condemned. And so they have to rely on data or findings that are somewhat limited. But nonetheless, these limited findings do show a very good effect.
The Gerson therapy is using a lot of vegetables and vegetable juices. It's a pure vegan diet. There's a last question. I think we also have our cameraman here, so maybe our cameraman should also be allowed, I think. So I think 2 more. He's been working very hard. So first one here.
Yes. I was wondering about in China, they have self-healing exercises and Qigong and Tai Chi and very much mindset about this. And that whole food, raw food, makes you really high and happy. And this also affects the body and how it's functioning.
The martial art practice or the Tai Chi?
No, the overall in China, they are very healthy and do a lot of movements and breathing to the stomach, and they think about the body as a qi system that have to flow.
Is that a question? He's wondering about the traditional Chinese practices like Tai Chi, Qigong. How do you think that affects health?
I can't really. I'm not a clinician, number one. Number two, even as a scientist, I'm not familiar with the literature on that. So I can only speak to it from a personal sort of perspective. And I think from my many Chinese friends and colleagues who do that, others, they get satisfaction from it. They get some relaxation. It reduces stress, and so forth. It's a very old tradition, as we all know, and I just think it's a good idea. But the extent to which it actually can, let's say, reverse disease or that kind of thing I'm talking about, I just don't know.
Good, thank you. So now the final question is coming.
Okay. First of all, thank you. Thank you so much for all the work. We really appreciate it and all that. First, I might tell the audience here also that I'm actually one of those who live off of fruits and vegetables, like she said before, the fruitarians. So my question is, I generally end up at about 90% carbohydrates, and they are basically all from fruit. So I only eat sugar from fruits, basically. No refined foods whatsoever, no cooked, no nothing like that. Very little starches. And then 5% fats and 5% proteins. That's what I end up at from eating lots of fruit and lots of greens. In my experience, and I've also been vegan for 19 years, more or less, so I haven't had any animal products. In my experience, this diet of the raw fruits and the greens have brought me so much further in terms of health compared to a regular vegan or even a very, very healthy vegan diet with a lot of vegetables and whole foods. What is your view on this and the ratios that I end up at 95/5 in terms of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins? Thank you.
I heard that question, and I think the best evidence is that testimonial. Obviously, the gentleman, doing that for length of time and seeing that much benefit. All I can say is, basically go for it. It sounds great to me. I was in Lithuania recently, as I said before, and that conference was largely focused on raw food, juicing, and things like that. I heard a lot of people talk about the great benefits of that. Myself, I'm not, just using juicing and not 100%, raw food. So I don't know. All I can say is that common sense suggests to me that somebody that gets really close to a raw food diet, it's not a bad idea. It's quite good. And especially if they tell me that that's the benefits they get, well, what am I to say? I mean, I think it's...
We should just wrap up, so vi vil ha en ha det og adjø nå, ikke det? Vi prøver. Vi prøver å få tilbake samtalen. Det kan være for det nærmer seg en time. Da. Jeg vil bare si at det er veldig fint om dere som har Facebook liker Kina-studien på Facebook, for jeg vil gjerne være i kommunikasjon med folk om dette temaet hvis jeg har masse ressurser og ting som jeg har lyst til å dele med de som er interessert. Eller så kan dere skrive meg på en e-post, og det kan dere få av meg på Kina-studien Facebook. Eller så heter jeg Ingela Flatin @yahoo.no. Så det har vært veldig fint om de som er interessert i dette temaet. Jeg er veldig interessert i flere sånne venner. Så det var min avslutning.
Jeg får vel begynne jeg da, som var den første til å starte. Jeg synes at det Campbell sier det er veldig interessant. Han har rett i en del ting han sier, at vi gjør studier på befolkninger som da ikke, hvor det ikke finnes folk som har plant-based whole food. Og det gjør det litt problematisk at vi vet ikke helt hvor langt vi kan få hjerte-kardødeligheten ned dersom man har den type kosthold. Ingela, når du spurte om barn, så var det min bekymring for at det krever faktisk litt kunnskap når det gjelder å sette sammen en riktig kosthold. Det kan gjøres med folk som har kunnskap, men jeg tenker jo, fordi jeg er i samfunnsernæring, så tenker jeg på alle de menneskene som ikke har den type kunnskap, som for eksempel spiser vegan. Han ville jo ikke si at dette var vegankosthold i det hele tatt. Han likte heller ikke vegetarianere, for han visste at mange av disse menneskene gjør det for etiske årsaker, og de har kanskje ikke den kunnskapen som de må ha for å spise på den måten som han anbefaler. Så jeg synes at det hadde vært veldig fint hvis vi kunne få noe mer evidence-based her på den type kosthold, så er jeg all for it.
Ja, de studiene de kommer nok på bordet i løpet av noen år. Som jeg nevnte i stad, så gjøres det flere av de studiene i USA, så det blir veldig, veldig spennende å se. Jeg ble jo spesielt glad for å høre hva Campbell har å si i forhold til dette med økologisk og ikke-økologisk, for der har han ikke flagget det så på den måten tidligere. Så jeg synes han kommer med veldig, veldig mye bra, så jeg vil anbefale alle å kjøpe boka og lese den og omsette kunnskapen i praktisk handling. Det er det koker ned til syvende og sist.
Og jeg har lyst til å følge opp der, fordi at en ting er å vite at det er bra, en annen ting er å få tilgjengelig de matvarene. Det er ikke enkelt i dag å gå og handle de matvarene som vi vet er bra. Det er ikke lett tilgjengelig alle produkter i alle butikker i nærmiljø. Og vi trenger også kunnskap I forhold til hvordan vi lærer ungdom å lage mat, sånn at de også kan få erfaringsbasert mat med seg som en del av sin kultur.